It's a late-night broadcast in the 1970s, and America is glued to their television sets watching The Tonight Show. Suddenly, onto the stage walks a stunning blonde woman with an unmistakable presence. Tall, glamorous, with a voice that was both sultry and innocent at the same time. She wasn't just beautiful. She had that rare combination of comedic timing, physical grace, and an ability to make Johnny Carson himself crack up on live television. Her name was Carol Wayne, and if you were watching late-night TV during the golden age of Johnny Carson, you knew exactly who she was. But what you probably don't know is that behind that bubbly, seemingly carefree persona was a woman whose life story reads like a Hollywood thriller. Filled with childhood dreams cut short by injury, marriages to powerful men, brushes with fame, and ultimately, a mysterious death that remains one of entertainment's most haunting unsolved mysteries. What really happened to Carol Wayne? Why did her life end so tragically in the shallow waters of a Mexican resort? And what secrets did she take with her to the grave? Stay with me, because the story I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about the woman who became a television icon. Carol Marie Wayne was born on September 6, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a world that was about to be forever changed by World War II. She grew up in Lincolnwood, a quiet suburb of Chicago, but her childhood was anything but ordinary. Carol had a younger sister named Nina, and if you saw the two of them together, you'd think you were seeing double. They were practically identical, both blessed with stunning good looks and an athletic grace that would soon propel them into the spotlight. But before Carol ever stepped foot on a Hollywood soundstage, before she ever stood next to Johnny Carson in one of those infamous Tea Time movie sketches, she was a figure skater. And not just any figure skater, but a genuinely talented one with dreams of making it big on the ice. This was the era when polio was still a terrifying reality for American families, and every parent held their breath hoping their children would be spared from this devastating disease. The Wayne sisters, thankfully, escaped polio, but their childhood was shaped by something else entirely, an all-consuming dedication to figure skating that would define their teenage years. When Carol was just a teenager, she and Nina were plucked from their local Chicago rink and offered contracts to tour with the Ice Capades, one of the most prestigious ice skating shows in the country. Imagine being that young and suddenly finding yourself traveling across America, performing in front of thousands of people every night. The Wayne sisters, as they were known, became a featured act with the Ice Capades, their synchronized routines and matching ponytails making them crowd favorites wherever they performed. They weren't just skating. They were living a life that most teenagers could only dream about. But this life of glamour and applause came at a cost. While other girls their age were going to school dances and football games, Carol and Nina were rehearsing for hours every day, maintaining strict diets, and traveling from city to city in what must have felt like an endless tour. They missed out on what most people would consider a normal childhood, but they were chasing a dream, and for a while, it seemed like that dream was becoming a reality. Carol was talented, dedicated, and beautiful, a combination that should have guaranteed her a long and successful career on the ice. But fate had other plans. The injury came suddenly and devastatingly, during one performance or practice. The exact details vary depending on which account you read. Carol suffered a serious knee injury that effectively ended her skating career. Just like that, the dream she'd been pursuing since she was a young girl was over. For someone who had dedicated their entire teenage years to figure skating, who had sacrificed a normal childhood for the chance to perform, this must have been absolutely crushing. But here's where Carol's story takes an interesting turn, because instead of giving up on show business altogether, she decided to pivot. If she couldn't glide across the ice, she would find another stage. And that stage, as it turned out, was in Las Vegas, where Carol reinvented herself as a showgirl with the famous Folies Bergere at the Tropicana Hotel. Now, you have to understand what it meant to be a showgirl in Las Vegas during the 1960s. This wasn't just dancing. This was high art, elaborate productions with incredible costumes, choreography, and performances that rivaled anything you'd see on Broadway. Carol, with her height, she stood at 5 feet 9 inches, which was quite tall for a woman in that era, and her figure skating background was a natural fit for this world. Las Vegas in the 1960s was a playground for entertainers, celebrities, and people looking to make their fortunes. It was where Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack ruled the night, where mobsters rubbed shoulders with movie stars, and where anything seemed possible if you had the looks, the talent, and the connections. Carol had all three. Her time as a showgirl in Vegas wasn't just a job. It was a networking opportunity that would eventually lead her to Hollywood. She was meeting producers, directors, photographers, and actors who frequented the shows, and it was during this period that Carol began to seriously consider a career in television and film. She had the looks that cameras loved, and there was something about her presence that was both sexy and comedic at the same time. She could play the ditzy blonde, but there was an intelligence behind those eyes, a sharpness to her comedic timing that suggested she was in on the joke. This combination would soon make her perfect for a particular role that would define her career, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1965, Carol married her first husband, Loretto Larry Sarah. She was 23 years old, and like many young women, she probably thought this was the beginning of her happily ever after. But the marriage lasted less than 2 years. By June 1967, Carol and Larry had divorced, and she was single again. The failure of her first marriage must have been difficult, but Carol wasn't the type to dwell on setbacks. She had survived the end of her skating career and reinvented herself once. She could do it again. And in 1967, something happened that would change the trajectory of her entire life. She got her first appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Now, you might think that one appearance on a late-night talk show wouldn't be that big of a deal, but you'd be wrong. The Tonight Show in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s and early 1980s wasn't just a television program. It was a cultural institution. Johnny Carson was the king of late night, and an appearance on his show could make or break careers. Comedians lived and died by how well they did during their first appearance on Carson's couch. Actors plugged their movies knowing that millions of Americans were watching. And for Carol Wayne, that first appearance on February 26, 1967, was the beginning of a beautiful and enduring relationship with the show. But Carol didn't become famous for sitting on the couch chatting with Johnny, although she did do that on occasion. No, Carol's claim to fame was as the Matinee Lady in Johnny Carson's recurring tea time movie sketches. Let me paint a picture for you of what these sketches were like, because if you never had the pleasure of watching them, you missed something truly special. Johnny would appear as Art Fern, a sleazy, fast-talking movie host character complete with a ridiculous toupee, loud plaid jackets, and a pencil-thin mustache. Art Fern was supposed to be hosting a movie during the tea time slot, and he'd give these deliberately terrible plot summaries of fake films with ridiculous names like El Moldo or The Cliffs of Whitey. But the real attraction wasn't the fake movies, it was the Matinee Lady, played by Carol Wayne. She would stand next to Art Fern in these elaborate, often revealing costumes, playing the role of his assistant who was, to put it mildly, not the sharpest tool in the shed. But here's what made Carol brilliant in this role. She never played it mean-spiritedly. The Matinee Lady wasn't stupid. She was innocent, sweet, and genuinely confused by everything Art Fern was saying. Carol would stand there in her form-fitting dress, batting her eyes, speaking in that high-pitched, breathy voice, and making innuendos that flew completely over the Matinee Lady's head even as the audience howled with laughter. The genius of these sketches was the interplay between Johnny's lecherous Art Fern character and Carol's naive Matinee Lady. Art Fern would make double entendres and suggestive comments, and the Matinee Lady would respond with complete innocence, not understanding why the audience was laughing. Johnny would often break character and crack up at Carol's delivery, and those moments of genuine laughter between the two performers became as much a part of the sketch as the scripted jokes. Carol appeared in these tea time movie sketches regularly from 1971 through 1984, making her one of the most recurring guest performers in Tonight Show history. She became such an integral part of the show that when she was eventually replaced by Teresa Gansel in her later years, audiences noticed the difference. There was something special about Carol's chemistry with Johnny, something that couldn't quite be replicated. But Carol's career wasn't limited to The Tonight Show, even though that's what she's primarily remembered for today. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Carol was a working actress who appeared in numerous television shows and films. She had roles in classic TV series like Love, American Style, where she played various characters between 1970 and 1972. She appeared on The Bold Ones, The Lawyers in 1971, and she was a regular presence on game shows, which were incredibly popular during this era. Carol was a panelist on Celebrity Sweepstakes, and she made appearances on shows like Hollywood Squares and Mantrap. These game show appearances were important for actors like Carol because they kept you in the public eye and provided steady work between other roles. The 1970s was also when Carol's film career began to take off, although she never became a major movie star. She appeared in Gun in 1967, which was directed by Blake Edwards, and she also had a role in Edwards' 1968 comedy The Party, which starred Peter Sellers. Working with Blake Edwards, one of Hollywood's most successful directors, should have been a stepping stone to bigger things. But Carol's film roles tended to be smaller parts that capitalized on her looks rather than her comedic abilities. In 1969, Carol married again, this time to Barry Feinstein, a renowned rock and roll photographer who had worked with some of the biggest names in music. This marriage seemed more substantial than her first. Barry was an established artist with connections throughout the entertainment industry, and in 1970, Carol gave birth to their son, Alex Feinstein. For a while, it seemed like Carol had found some stability in her personal life. She was a working actress with a steady gig on The Tonight Show, she was married to a successful photographer, and she was a mother. But the marriage to Barry didn't last either. By 1974, Carol and Barry had divorced, and Carol was once again single, this time with a young son to raise. Being a single mother in Hollywood while trying to maintain a career is challenging under any circumstances, but Carol seemed to handle it. She continued working, continued appearing on The Tonight Show, and in 1975, she married for a third time, this time to Burt Sugarman, a successful television producer who created The Midnight Special, a popular music variety show that aired on NBC. Burt Sugarman was a big deal in the television industry. He was wealthy, connected, and successful. Exactly the kind of man who could have helped Carol's career reach new heights. But once again, the marriage didn't work out. Carol and Burt divorced in 1980, and by this point, Carol had been married and divorced 3 times before she was even 40 years old. This pattern of failed relationships would become a recurring theme in her life, and friends and colleagues later speculated about whether Carol was searching for something she could never quite find: security, love, acceptance, or maybe just someone who understood the complicated, often lonely life of a performer. The early 1980s should have been a good time for Carol professionally. She was still making regular appearances on The Tonight Show, still getting work in television and film. In 1982, she appeared in Savannah Smiles, a family comedy that became something of a cult classic. In 1983, she had a role in Surf 2, a comedy that, while not exactly a critical darling, showcased Carol's willingness to take on different types of roles. But here's what's interesting about Carol's career trajectory. Despite being a recognizable face on television for nearly 2 decades, despite her regular appearances on one of the most watched shows in America, Carol never quite broke through to major stardom. She was always the supporting player, the beautiful blonde who got laughs but never the leading lady. This must have been frustrating for someone with Carol's talent and ambition. She had started out as a figure skater with dreams of greatness, reinvented herself as a showgirl, then as an actress, but she always seemed to be on the periphery of real success rather than at its center. By 1984, Carol was 42 years old, still beautiful, still working, but also dealing with some personal struggles that friends would later describe. She had gone through 3 divorces, she was raising a teenage son largely on her own, and the entertainment industry can be brutally ageist, especially toward women. That year, Carol filmed Heartbreakers, an independent film that would turn out to be her final movie role. The film, which starred Peter Coyote and Nick Mancuso, was about a struggling artist and a con man, and Carol played a character named Candy. The movie received positive reviews, and film critic Roger Ebert even mentioned Carol's performance specifically, noting her presence in the film. It was early January 1985, just a few weeks after Christmas and the start of a new year. Carol had recently finished filming Heartbreakers, and maybe she was feeling good about the role, optimistic about where her career might go next. She decided to take a vacation to Mexico, specifically to the Los Hatos resort in Manzanillo, Colima, a beautiful coastal area on Mexico's Pacific coast. The Los Hatos resort was and still is a stunning property, famous for its white Moorish architecture and its appearance in the 1979 movie 10, starring Bo Derek and Dudley Moore. It's the kind of place where wealthy people go to escape the pressures of everyday life, to relax in luxury and enjoy beautiful beaches and perfect weather. Carol didn't go to Mexico alone. Her traveling companion was a man named Edward Durston, a Los Angeles car dealer who was described as a friend or acquaintance. Now, here's where Carol's story takes a dark and mysterious turn, because Edward Durston wasn't just any car dealer. He had a disturbing connection to another tragic Hollywood death. More than 15 years earlier, on October 4th, 1969, Diane Linkletter, the 20-year-old daughter of famous television host Art Linkletter, fell to her death from a sixth-floor apartment window in West Hollywood. She was with Edward Durston when she died. Durston claimed that Diane was on LSD and jumped from the window during a bad trip. Art Linkletter, Diane's father, became a vocal anti-drug crusader after his daughter's death, believing that drugs had killed her. But there were always questions about what really happened that night, questions that were never fully answered. And now, 15 years later, Edward Durston was taking another trip with another blonde actress, this time to Mexico. What kind of person invites Edward Durston on vacation after his history? What was their relationship? These are questions that still don't have clear answers. According to reports, Carol and Edward checked into the Los Hadas resort on or around January 10, 1985. For the first day or so, everything seemed fine. They were enjoying the resort, the weather, the beach. But then, on their third day there, Carol and Edward had an argument. Details about what they argued about are sketchy and contradictory. Some reports say it was about money. Others suggest it was about their relationship or something Edward had said or done that upset Carol. Whatever the cause of the argument, it was serious enough that Carol stormed off. According to Edward Durston's account, and remember, he's the only living witness to what happened next, Carol told him she was going for a walk on the beach to cool off. This was January 13, 1985. Edward claimed that he waited for Carol to return, but as the hours passed and she didn't come back, he started to worry. Or at least, that's what he said later. Here's where the story gets murky and troubling. Durston claimed he waited 3 days before reporting Carol missing. 3 days. Let that sink in for a moment. Your travel companion, a woman you're supposedly friendly enough with to go on vacation together, storms off after an argument and doesn't come back to the hotel room, and you wait 3 days before telling anyone? That detail alone has fueled decades of speculation about what really happened. When Durston finally did report Carol missing, local authorities began a search. On January 13, 1985, 3 days after she had allegedly gone for that walk on the beach, a local fisherman found Carol Wayne's body floating in Santiago Bay, in water that was only 4 feet deep. She was still fully clothed. There were no signs of trauma to her body, no cuts, no bruises, no abrasions that would suggest she had fallen or been in a struggle. An autopsy was performed by Mexican authorities, and the results were both puzzling and disturbing. Carol had no alcohol in her system, no drugs, nothing that would explain how a 42-year-old woman could drown in shallow water in broad daylight. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, but that explanation satisfied almost no one who knew Carol or who looked closely at the circumstances. Here's what made the drowning theory so hard to accept. Carol Wayne, by all accounts, was terrified of water and couldn't swim. She knew she couldn't swim. Would a woman who was afraid of water and couldn't swim really go walking along a beach after dark by herself? Would she somehow end up in the water, in her clothes, and drown in water so shallow that she could have stood up? The logistics of it just didn't make sense. And then there was the 3-day delay before Edward Durston reported her missing. What was he doing during those 3 days? Was he really at the resort, waiting for Carol to come back? Or was something else going on? Mexican authorities ruled the death accidental and closed the case relatively quickly. But back in the United States, Carol's family and friends were devastated and full of questions that would never be adequately answered. Carol's ex-husband Barry Feinstein, the father of her son Alex, initially resisted the cremation of Carol's body because he wanted an independent investigation into her death. But after reviewing the Mexican autopsy report, he eventually agreed to allow Carol's body to be cremated. Some have suggested that the decision to cremate was pushed by people who didn't want further investigation. Carol Wayne's death made headlines in the entertainment press. Johnny Carson, who had worked with Carol for so many years, reportedly didn't comment publicly on her death at the time, which some found strange given their long professional relationship. Other Tonight Show regulars and Hollywood colleagues expressed shock and sadness, but the mystery of what really happened in Mexico that January night persisted. In the years since Carol's death, various theories have emerged about what might have happened. Some believe it was genuinely an accident, that Carol, upset after her argument with Durston, went walking on the beach, somehow ended up in the water, panicked because she couldn't swim, and tragically drowned. Others suspect foul play, pointing to Edward Durston's troubling history and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Carol's disappearance and death. There's also the question of why Carol was even in Mexico with Edward Durston in the first place. By 1985, Durston's connection to Diane Linkletter's death was public knowledge. Anyone who knew Hollywood history would have known about it. So why would Carol agree to vacation with him? Did she not know about his past? Were they romantically involved? Was he helping her with something? These questions have never been answered satisfactorily. Some investigators and amateur sleuths have pointed out that Carol's death followed a pattern disturbingly similar to Diane Linkletter's death 15 years earlier. Both were young blonde women. Both died in the company of Edward Durston, and both deaths raised more questions than they answered. It's the kind of coincidence that's hard to ignore, even if there's no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Durston himself maintained until his own death that Carol's drowning was a tragic accident and that he had nothing to do with it. He claimed that he and Carol were just friends, that the argument they had wasn't serious, and that he had no idea what happened to her during those 3 days she was missing. But his story has never satisfied those who believe there's more to Carol Wayne's death than meets the eye. In the decades since Carol's death, she's been remembered primarily for her work on The Tonight Show. Clips of her tea time movie sketches with Johnny Carson have been posted on YouTube and other video platforms, introducing new generations to her comedic talent and her unique screen presence. When people watch those old clips now, they see a beautiful, funny woman who clearly loved performing and who had a natural chemistry with one of television's all-time greats. But they're also watching someone whose life ended far too soon and under circumstances that remain mysterious and troubling. Carol's son Alex Feinstein grew up without his mother, who died when he was just a teenager. What must it be like to lose your mother under such circumstances? To know that the truth about her death might never be fully known. Carol's sister Nina, her look-alike sibling who had shared so much of her early life skating with the Ice Capades, had to grapple with the loss of her sister and the unanswered questions surrounding her death. The entertainment industry moved on, as it always does, but those who knew Carol or who appreciated her talent never forgot her. Looking back at Carol Wayne's life from the vantage point of today, it's impossible not to see a tragic arc. Here was a woman who had so much talent, who overcame the disappointment of her skating career ending, who reinvented herself multiple times, who made millions of people laugh, who was a mother and a friend and a professional who showed up and did her work even when her personal life was complicated. And yet, she never quite achieved the level of success and stability that she seemed to be reaching for. Her 3 failed marriages suggest a woman who was searching for something: love, security, partnership, but who never quite found it in the way she hoped. Her career, while successful by many measures, never quite broke through to the major stardom that seemed within her grasp. And her death, occurring when she was still relatively young and still working, cut short whatever possibilities might have been in her future. Was Carol Wayne simply unlucky? Did she make poor choices in the men she associated with? Was she, as some have suggested, too trusting and too naive despite her years in the entertainment business? Or was she the victim of something more sinister, something that was covered up or explained away as an accident? The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened on that beach in Mexico in January 1985. The people who might have provided answers are either deceased or have remained silent for decades. The Mexican authorities closed the case, and there's been no new investigation despite the questions that linger. Edward Durston died in 2013, taking whatever he knew about Carol's final hours to his grave. All we're left with are the facts as they've been reported, the inconsistencies in the story, and our own interpretations of what those inconsistencies might mean. What we can say with certainty is that Carol Wayne deserved better. Better than to die alone in shallow water thousands of miles from home. Better than to have her death dismissed as an accident without a thorough investigation. Better than to be remembered primarily as a mystery rather than for the talented performer she was. When you watch those old Tonight Show clips of Carol as the Matinee Lady, standing next to Johnny Carson in her glamorous outfits, delivering her lines with perfect comedic timing and that innocent charm that made her so endearing, remember that you're watching someone whose real life was far more complicated than the character she played. Remember that behind the beautiful blonde who made audiences laugh was a woman who had overcome significant obstacles, who had survived the disappointment of her skating dreams being cut short, who had navigated the often brutal entertainment industry for 2 decades, who had experienced the failure of 3 marriages and the challenges of single motherhood, and who, despite all of that, continued to show up and do her work with professionalism and grace. Carol Wayne's legacy shouldn't be limited to the mysterious circumstances of her death, though that mystery continues to fascinate people decades later. Her legacy should also include her contributions to television comedy during a golden age of late-night entertainment. She was part of a team that included Johnny Carson, Ed McMahon, Doc Severinsen, and all the other regulars who made The Tonight Show the most watched program in late-night television for decades. She made people laugh at a time when the country needed laughter. She brought joy into living rooms across America night after night, year after year. That's no small accomplishment, and it shouldn't be forgotten just because her life ended tragically. The story of Carol Wayne is a reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly circumstances can change, and how the truth can sometimes remain elusive despite our best efforts to find it. It's also a reminder of the pressures and challenges faced by performers, especially women in an industry that often valued them more for their looks than their talent, that discarded them as they aged, and that didn't always protect them from the darker elements that lurked in Hollywood's shadows. If Carol's story teaches us anything, it should be to look beyond the surface, to remember that every performer we see on screen is a real person with real struggles and real dreams, and to demand answers when those people meet untimely and suspicious ends. The mystery of Carol Wayne's death may never be completely solved, but her memory and her work live on, preserved in those old television clips that continue to make people smile. And maybe that's the most important thing, that despite everything that happened, despite the tragedy and the unanswered questions, Carol Wayne is still making people laugh all these decades later. That's the power of television, the permanence of performance, and the enduring legacy of someone who gave everything to her craft. Rest in peace, Carol Wayne. You deserved so much better than the hand life dealt you, but you handled it with grace and humor for as long as you could.